Today on Tricrow Studios, we're going to take a look at one of the most common questions that I get asked, and that is a Gibson Les Paul Studio a real Les Paul? So here's one of the most common scenarios here. There's a player out there that wants to get a Gibson Les Paul. So they see that the price tag on a Gibson Les Paul Studio is a little lower than like a standard or a classic or what have you. They save their money, they go out, they buy that guitar, they bring it home, they play it, they love it, it's awesome. And then someone comes up to them and goes, it's a Gibson Les Paul Studio. That's not a real Les Paul now, come on now. And then they kind of get disenchanted with the guitar, they feel a little bad about playing it, and then they really question as to, did I actually buy a Les Paul? But even before we get into the, taking a look at some of the differences between a Gibson Les Paul Studio and some of the higher end Gibson Les Pauls, if you like your guitar, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. If you're bonding with that guitar, it sounds good to you, you've got some good feeling when you play it, it doesn't matter what other people think. That's the amount of money that you've spent on a guitar means absolutely nothing if you don't like it. Now, there's quite a few people out there that will tell you that a Gibson Les Paul Standard is what the pros play. So getting a Gibson Les Paul Studio is a waste of time because it's like a student level guitar. That's absolutely not the case here. Because depending on your definition of what the pros play or who the pros are, a lot of famous people will actually play Gibson Les Paul Customs or custom shops. This is not a custom shop, by the way. But what a lot of people will do, which I always have found kind of confusing when people say, oh, the pros only play Gibson Les Paul Standards. What they actually do is, where it's a standard here, it also comes with like a blank truss rod cover. So what they'll generally do is they'll take the standard truss rod cover off here and use the blank. So that kind of creates the illusion of, hey, that could actually be a custom shop. And it's a little more traditional without the standard truss rod cover. I also want to take this time to note that I have 13 Gibson Les Pauls, and I own 2 that are Gibson Les Paul Studios. This is a 2013, and this is a 2014. The LP100 model. This has a wider fretboard. I don't play it as much. So let's take a look at some of the differences here between a Gibson Les Paul Studio and a couple of real Les Pauls. As a quick note here, this Gibson Les Paul Studio is a 2013 model. It has all of the exact same specs as the current run of the Gibson Les Paul Studios. However, this has a Granadillo fretboard and it has Kluson tuners. The Les Paul Studio is a slab of mahogany with a carved maple top on top of it with a mahogany neck. Now, on the other side of this slab of mahogany, before they actually put on the maple top, there's a whole bunch of carvings and routings here on the mahogany to make it lighter while still maintaining that sustain. Doing this does change the overall presence and resonance compared to a non-weight relieved Les Paul, but that's all up to personal preference. I have 2 Les Paul Classics. This is a 2020 Gibson Les Paul Classic, and this is a 2018 Gibson Les Paul Classic. The 2018 Gibson Les Paul Classic is spec'd exactly like a Les Paul Standard 60s. The Les Paul Classic is a slab of mahogany with a carved maple top and a mahogany neck. On the other side of this slab of mahogany, there's actually 9 holes that are placed throughout the body before the maple top is put on. That will ever so slightly change the weight of the guitar. Not a lot, and depending on the type of wood, because there's always variances, it can actually be as heavy as a non-weight relieved Les Paul. This will ever so slightly change the the overall resonance and presence compared to a non-weight relieved Les Paul, but not by much. And again, that's all up to preference. The Les Paul Traditional, which is now discontinued because they turned this into the standard 50s, is a slab of mahogany with a carved maple top where the flame is a little more visible, a little more present, and it still has the mahogany neck. Now, on the other side of the mahogany here, there's no carvings whatsoever. So this is much heavier and, again, has a different presence and resonance to the guitar, which is all still up to preference. The Gibson Les Paul Deluxe, spec'd exactly like a standard, yet with mini humbuckers, is a slab of mahogany with a carved maple top. In this case, even though the finish is a little different or deeper, the AAA or the flame is definitely a lot more present, and the neck is still mahogany. So nothing at all carved out on this slab of mahogany. I mean, other than the spot for the pickups and the controls. I have two Gibson Les Paul standards, a standard 50s and a standard 60s. Let's take a look at the standard 60s. The standard 60s, just like the standard 50s, is a slab of mahogany with a carved maple top where the flame is definitely a little more present and a little more visible here. And we have a mahogany neck. On the other side here of the mahogany, there's no holes or no routing, so this is a non-weight relieved Les Paul. Of course, I do have to say there is a little bit of routing just for the controls and the wires and stuff like that for the pickups, but that's it. So the rest of the differences here are mostly cosmetic, and they can change from year to year. So generally you're going to see differences like chrome hardware, nickel hardware, the Nashville style bridge or the ABR1 style bridge. No body binding, no neck binding, neck binding. The other big thing here is that the logo here is just silk screened on, whereas the logo here is actually inlaid onto the headstock. Things like tuners and that, they can vary from year to year, but if you're seeing like Kluson style or Grover tuners on the studios for that year, they're the exact same tuners that are used on the standards, classics, traditionals, and deluxes. Another difference is the way that the guitars are put together. So the studio here, if you were to remove the cavity, you would see a PCB. That's what that does there is that actually saves them time on manufacturing the guitar, as well as it saves money because you don't have to pay someone to hand solder. That means that the capacitors are generally built in to the PCB along with the spots for the potentiometers. One downfall there is that if you were to change your pickups, you generally have to buy all new pots, capacitors, and wiring to resolder everything. But a big plus here is that the studio actually has push-pulls to turn the get a little bit of a single coil sound out of the P9 or out of the humbuckers here, which kind of sounds like P90s, and that's easily done with the PCB rather than getting different pots and such to do that with the standards, which the standards nowadays do not come with push-pulls, and they are hand soldered, and they have orange drop capacitors and things like that. There are also different variations of studios and such, so you can get some studios that have binding on them, whether it's just the neck and not the body. You can have, I think they call them like Studio Plus, where instead of having just a regular maple top with a little bit of flame, it has like a single A or a double A flame top. And again, older studios did come with hard shell cases, whereas the new studios come with the padded gig bag type cases, which are about as damn sturdy as a hard shell case. So is the Gibson Les Paul Studio a Gibson Les Paul? Is it a real Les Paul? Yes. And you're definitely in a very strange category if you go around telling people who own Gibson Les Paul studios that they don't own a real Gibson Les Paul. That's just, you should be a lot better than that. A real Gibson Les Paul is made in the USA, has a slab of mahogany with a carved maple top, unless it's a junior or a special, which is just the slab of mahogany. We have 2 volumes, 2 tones, 2 humbuckers. We have, in this case, a Nashville bridge, but it's a 2-matic with a stop bar. 22 frets, a mahogany neck, although there are some maple neck Les Pauls out there. This has a gloss nitrocellulose finish. It's a cellulose finish. Whereas things like the Tributes and the Faded, those have satin nitrocellulose finish. 6 strings, huh? 6 strings. We have either Clouson style or Grover tuners. Says Gibson on the headstock, and gentlemen, silk screened here, just like on every other Les Paul, except for some different models. It says Les Paul model. So it's really hard to argue whether it is a real Gibson Les Paul, because it is a real Gibson Les Paul. Does it feel different than like a standard or what have you? Yes, there's definitely a lot of differences there between a modern or ultra modern weight relieved Les Paul and a non-weight relieved Les Paul. When it comes to having binding on the neck, there's little nubs that go over the fret ends, which kind of can help comfort. And the binding on the body, over years, it does kind of shrink, or the wood kind of changes size and stuff like that, and you feel that indentation. Does that mean you're wrong for owning a Gibson Les Paul? If you like the Gibson Les Paul Studio, then it doesn't matter what anyone thinks, whether they try to tell you that you don't have a real Les Paul because it doesn't say standard or doesn't have the blank on the truss rod cover. You have a real Gibson Les Paul. It's all down to personal preference, whether you like that guitar or not, whether you wish it had other features and stuff like that. But stop letting people tell you that it's not a real Gibson Les Paul. And I'll argue to the end of the world when people say to me, like, hey, I have a Gibson Les Paul Studio, but I'd really like to have a standard, but I've never played one. But I don't have a real Gibson Les Paul Studio, or I don't have a real Gibson Les Paul because it's a studio model. I'll argue with you. I prefer standards, I prefer classics, and I prefer the deluxe over the studio. But I still love the Gibson Les Paul Studio because it's a real Gibson Les Paul. It feels really good when I'm playing it, and it's a good quality instrument.